I still remember the precise moment he stepped into our home, sunlight falling across the hallway tiles, his silhouette breaking the rhythm of my afternoon. He didn't knock. He had a key. Of course he had a key. He was family. My husband's. Son from his first marriage, now a grown man, fresh from university, with nowhere else to stay during his job search. He wasn't a stranger. And yet, everything about him felt like a disruption. The air shifted that day. It wasn't something tangible, not in the way scent or sound lingers. It was more like a hum. Beneath my skin, like my body had already registered something my mind refused to name, he dropped his bags by the stairs with an offhanded grunt and called out casually, "Hope there's room for me in this palace." That word, palace, landed, bitter on my tongue. My husband liked to think of our home that way. Cold, immaculate, expansive, a place where the rooms echoed because there wasn't enough intimacy to fill them. I'd spent the morning tidying up the guest room, not because I wanted to impress him, not consciously, but I'd lingered over the sheets, chosen the lighter duvet, lit a candle with some vague citrus name. At the time, I'd told myself it was just hospitality. Later, I realized it was the beginning of something else. My husband came home early that evening. He was in good spirits, laughing more than usual, pouring wine, speaking loudly as if to fill every silence. I watched the two of them interact. Stiff handshakes, awkward grins. There was no warmth between them, only polite obligation. I served dinner, moved through the motions. When I caught the young man's eyes across the table, he smiled. Genuine, soft-edged. My stomach tightened. We made space for him in our home, and with that space, a new current began threading through the walls. He didn't do anything overt. He was just present, lingering in the kitchen while I cooked, asking thoughtful questions about my work, noticing things, how I changed my hair, the perfume I wore. My husband never noticed those things. He believed love was in provision, not observation. He paid the bills, brought home flowers on anniversaries, touched me out of routine. I didn't blame him. That was how he was taught to love. Quietly, distantly, predictably. But I had grown tired of predictability. It had become a soft ache, like wearing the same heels too long. They still fit, but they hurt in ways I no longer wanted to ignore. One morning, I stepped out of the shower and stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I toweled my hair slowly, let it fall around my shoulders. My body, though older, still held its shape, its curves. I opened my lingerie drawer and hesitated. Then I reached for the deep wine-colored set I hadn't worn in months. It wasn't for my husband, and that thought both startled and electrified me. We ran into each other in the hallway. He looked at me, really looked. His gaze flicked down, then up again, controlled, measured. "Morning," he said, "just one." Word. But it rang in my ears long after he passed. It wasn't what he said. It was the silence that followed, thick with things unsaid. In the evenings, my husband would retreat to his study with his spreadsheets, his quiet obsessions. Meanwhile, I'd sit at the kitchen table, a glass of wine untouched in front of me, and wait for footsteps. Sometimes they came, sometimes they didn't. But I had started listening for them, measuring the time between each creak of the floorboards upstairs. I didn't speak to anyone about it, not my friends, not my sister. I wasn't ready to name what was forming between us, maybe because once something is named, it demands to be dealt with. One night I stayed up late watching a film. He came in halfway through and sat on the far end of the couch. We didn't talk, just shared the silence, each pretending the movie held our full attention. But I felt it. The awareness. The heat. I turned off the TV and stood to leave. As I passed, his hand brushed my arm. It was brief, accidental, but the spot where he touched me burned. Back in bed, beside my husband's steady breath, I stared. At the ceiling, fingers curled into the sheets. I wasn't sure if I was angry, ashamed, excited, or all three at once, but I knew this. Something had shifted, something real, and I was no longer just his stepmother. I could feel it building. Already, like a storm still over the hills, not here yet, but coming. I didn't plan to stay up that late again, but the day had left me restless, my skin humming under every fabric I wore, my thoughts darting like moths against glass. It was nearing midnight. When I heard the low thud of the refrigerator door from the kitchen, I moved without thinking, barefoot, robe loosely tied at the waist. Nothing underneath except the same wine-colored lace I'd chosen that morning. I told myself I was just thirsty. That was the lie I clung to as I stepped softly down the hallway, heart tapping faster with every breath. The kitchen lights were off, but the glow from the fridge painted soft lines across the tiles. He stood with the door open, shirtless, hair tousled, a glass of juice halfway to his lips. He didn't turn when he heard me, only said, "Can't sleep either." I gave a vague answer. I don't even remember what. But I do remember how he finally turned to look at me. His eyes paused at my neckline, then lifted slowly to meet mine. There was nothing lewd in his gaze. It was quiet, steady, like he was trying to read something I wasn't ready to say out loud. I crossed the room, opened the cupboard, reached for a glass. I could feel the robe slip slightly over my shoulder. I could have adjusted it. I didn't. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound a faint buzz from the fridge. I was hyper-aware of the space between us, how narrow it was, how easily it could disappear. He leaned slightly against the counter, his fingers tapping the rim of his glass, his gaze flicking now and then toward me, like he was trying not to look and failing. Then something shifted. One of those wordless, irreversible moments that never announces itself. We turned at the same time. Or maybe I turned first. Our movements weren't planned, but they met perfectly in the middle. And then it happened. He kissed me. It wasn't cautious, it wasn't curious, it was urgent and silent and inevitable. His hand touched my waist like it had been there 1,000 times before. I didn't move away. I didn't freeze. My lips met his like they belonged there, like they'd been waiting to be claimed. The kiss lasted seconds, maybe less, but it shattered something, as if a pane of glass that had separated us had finally cracked under pressure. And when I pulled back, because I had to, there was no apology in his face, only breath, heavy and close. We stood still, like two people caught in a tremor, pretending. Nothing had moved. I shouldn't have. I started, but stopped. Even my voice didn't believe the protest. He said nothing, just stepped back slightly, giving me space I didn't ask for but suddenly needed. I left the room quickly, the glass of water forgotten, the taste of him still warm against my mouth. My legs trembled on the stairs, not from fear. From knowing, back in my room, I didn't wake my husband. He slept on his side, mouth slightly open, face softened by the dark. I lay beside him, wide awake. The ceiling a blank canvas onto which I projected every second of what just happened. I touched my lips. They still tingled. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I wasn't sorry. I wasn't proud either. What I felt was something more dangerous than guilt, anticipation. The next morning was cruelly ordinary. He sat across the table, sipping coffee, nodding at something my husband said about a mutual fund. I smiled when expected, poured orange juice, folded napkins. All the while, the air buzzed between us like a live wire. We didn't look at each other, but I could feel him. I dressed carefully. That day, not provocatively but intentionally, a soft blouse that clung just slightly at the waist, jeans that fit a little too well, no jewelry except a thin gold chain that rested above my collarbone. Underneath, I wore the same lace from the night before. I told myself I didn't know why, but I did. The hours dragged. My husband left for a client meeting by noon. I wandered the house in a haze, started laundry, watered the plants, anything to ground myself, but everything I touched felt irrelevant. All I could think about was the kitchen, the quiet, the pressure of his mouth. The heat in his hands. I heard his footsteps behind me in the hallway. My spine straightened. He passed without a word, just a glance. But his fingers grazed mine for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. My whole body lit up like a struck match. The day unfolded in fragments. I remember music playing softly from his room, the faint sound of a video game. Then laughter. At one point, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her lips were fuller, her eyes darker. Something had awakened in her, something no longer willing to be silent by evening. The storm inside me had settled into something calmer, but more dangerous. I didn't feel chaotic. I felt focused, hungry, alive. I didn't kiss him again that day, but I knew it would happen. The kiss wasn't a mistake. It was a signal, and once signals are sent, they don't fade. They wait for the next moment, for the next touch, for the next time we're alone. The silence between us didn't last long. By the third morning, my husband announced during breakfast, somewhere between commenting on the lack of marmalade and reading stock updates aloud, that he had to leave town for a few days. A last-minute client retreat at a lakeside estate. Just outside the city, a gathering of men in expensive jackets pretending to bond over cigars and golf. I feigned polite interest, asked all the right questions. How long? Will you be taking the company car? Do you want me to pack? For you, and folded each answer into the tidy version of myself I used to keep peace. He kissed the top of my head without really noticing me, and told me not to wait up on Friday. He'd be leaving early and returning Sunday night. I don't remember. If I smiled, I only remember locking eyes with the man across the table, the one who used to be a child and now sat opposite me in a faded t-shirt, his forearms resting against the edge of the wood, his gaze low but burning. He would be staying. I would be staying, and the walls that usually held everything in place would be quieter, looser, thinner. After my husband left for work, the house grew silent. That kind of silence that breathes, not empty, but filled with possibility. The kind that made my skin itch and pulse in places I hadn't paid attention to in years. I kept myself occupied, changed the sheets, vacuumed. The corners my housekeeper usually missed, rearranged the spice rack, every task done not for the sake of doing, but to silence the rush of anticipation in my veins. Around noon, he came downstairs, hair still damp from a shower, the same gray shirt from yesterday, but on him, everything looked deliberate. He leaned in the doorway and asked casually if I wanted anything from the cafe on the corner. I'm heading out for a bit. I shook my head, thanked him. My voice was steadier than I expected. He hesitated before leaving. You sure? There was a pause, too long for comfort, long enough for meaning to gather in the space between us like dust in the sun. Yeah, I said. I'm fine. I wasn't. The next few hours dragged. I tried reading, tried responding to emails, tried calling my sister, but hung up before the third ring. I couldn't focus. My body was there, on the couch. But my thoughts wandered. I went to the closet and stood for several minutes without moving. I reached for a particular dress. Soft beige, cinched at the waist, delicate buttons that ran down to the knees. It wasn't overly revealing, but it hugged in the right places. I put it on without thinking too much. Then came the shoes, low heels, casual but flattering. I stood in front of the mirror, tilted my head, adjusted a curl. Underneath, I chose the black lace set, not red, not wine, something quieter, but no less deliberate. It made me feel anchored. It made me feel like I was choosing this, not stumbling into it. When he returned, the sun had already dipped below the rooftops. I was in the kitchen, hands busy slicing herbs, the scent of roasted garlic wrapping the room in warmth. He stopped, in the doorway again, this time with a paper bag and 2 drinks. Figured you might want something sweet, he said, placing a small pastry box on the counter. I thanked him, he nodded. The way he looked at me was different now. Not hungry, not desperate. Something more dangerous, controlled, waiting. A man who knew time was on his side. We ate dinner together, side by side at the kitchen island. We talked about nothing. The news, some show he was watching, the weather, but underneath every word was a thrum. His knee brushed mine once, and neither of us moved. I felt the contact travel up through my thigh and lodge itself somewhere just below my ribs. After we ate, he offered to help with dishes. We moved around the kitchen carefully, like 2 people preparing for a dance they both knew the steps to but had never performed. He reached for a glass just as I did. Our hands touched. We froze. This time we didn't speak. We didn't pretend. He didn't pull away. And I didn't either. He stepped closer, eyes searching mine, as if asking permission without words. I didn't give it. I didn't need to. Everything in my posture said what I couldn't. My breath hitched, my hands trembled. He didn't kiss. Me, not yet. Instead, he gently tucked a damp strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was feather-light, reverent, but it sent a bolt of heat through me. My mouth parted involuntarily. I felt completely seen, and I didn't want to look away. The moment broke with the sharp trill of my husband's ringtone on the kitchen counter. I stepped back quickly, answered with a shaky hand. He was calling to remind me to put a document in his study for a courier. His voice sounded far away. Irrelevant, I promised him I would, then hung up and stood in place, my heart hammering behind. Me, the man I'd almost kissed, was still there, still silent. "I'll be in my room," he finally said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were still wet from the sink, but my skin felt like fire. When I went upstairs that night, I walked past his door. Light spilled out from the bottom. I didn't stop, but I slowed. I slipped into bed and lay there, fully awake, staring at the ceiling. Again. But this time, it wasn't dread or guilt that filled me. It was inevitability. The next morning unfolded like any other, though nothing about me felt ordinary. I moved through my routine on autopilot. Coffee, light breakfast, answering emails I didn't care about. But my mind hovered elsewhere, circling. Back to the unfinished moment in the kitchen. A moment that had left its imprint on my body like a shadow cast long after the sun had passed. We hadn't touched again. We hadn't spoken about it. But everything had changed by noon. The weather turned. The forecast had warned of a storm moving in from the west, but the clouds arrived faster than expected, rolling in like smoke across the sky. I stood by the window, watching the first drops hit the glass in slow, deliberate patterns. The air grew heavy, humid, almost thick enough to touch, that kind of weight that promises something will break. Then came the text, a single sentence, clean and careful. "I'm driving up to the lake house. Want to come?" No pretense, no explanation, just the question. I stared at it for longer than I should have. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. I could have said no. I should have. But that moment in the kitchen had already written the next page for me. And all I had to do was follow. I answered, "Give me 20 minutes. The lake house wasn't far, an hour and some change north. My husband had bought it as a retreat years ago, though we rarely went. He preferred hotels, and I preferred not arguing. But I remembered its silence, the wooden deck that creaked under bare feet, the tall windows overlooking still water. It was secluded, simple, and more private than any hotel room could ever be. I dressed with deliberation. Casual but not careless, a linen shirt tied loosely at the waist, soft jeans that followed the shape of my legs, flat shoes, hair brushed but not pinned. Underneath, pale blue lace that felt like memory and temptation woven together. My hands trembled as I packed a light bag. Nothing dramatic, just an overnight kit, just in case. He waited outside in the car, engine running, music low. I slid into the passenger seat without speaking. Our eyes met for a moment, a silent agreement passing between us. This wasn't a getaway. This was a choice. The drive was mostly quiet. He asked if I was comfortable. I nodded. We said little else, but the tension stretched between us like a drawn bow, waiting. The road narrowed as we neared the lake. Trees leaned in over the gravel, the wind pushing through their branches like a whisper. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a sheen on the leaves and the faint scent of wet bark and soil. When we arrived, he parked beneath the wooden awning and stepped out first, grabbing the bag from the trunk. I followed him up the steps, heart pounding, body alert. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and closed rooms. The furniture was simple. Dark wood, soft throws, mismatched cushions. A layer of dust told me it hadn't been used in months, maybe more. Still, it felt lived in, like a place waiting to be remembered. He opened the windows, let in the sound of the water. I walked through the rooms slowly, trailing my fingers along the walls, remembering where everything was kept. The coffee pot, the extra blanket, the book I'd once left on the side table and never finished. We didn't rush anything. That surprised me. He made tea while I stood in the living room, arms crossed against my chest, not to block him out, but to hold something inside. He handed me the mug without a word. Our fingers brushed. The heat from the ceramic seeped into my skin. The afternoon passed in a strange, suspended quiet. We moved around each other like gravity had shifted, every step careful, every glance more loaded than the last. I watched him read by the fireplace. He watched me brush my hair on the porch. Everything we did was layered with the tension of what hadn't yet happened. When the sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the lake in gold and smoke, he stepped outside and called for me to join him. We sat on the deck in silence. He broke it softly. "You're different here." I didn't ask what he meant, I knew. I took a long breath, watching the ripples move across the surface of the water. "So, are you?" He turned slightly, just enough for our shoulders to touch. Not fully, just enough. "Are you scared?" he asked after a while. The answer formed in my mouth before I could decide whether it was true. "Yes." He didn't push, didn't try to soothe me. He just let the moment hang. Eventually, I stood, stretched slowly, and said I was going to light the fireplace inside. He followed without a word. The shift between us was so quiet, it felt like exhaling. Inside, the living room glowed in soft amber from the first flames. I sat on the edge of the couch, hands still wrapped around the empty mug. He sat next to me, close enough to feel the warmth of his thigh against mine. My heart beat fast, but not wild. It was focused now, certain. And then, for a second time, it happened. But this wasn't the kiss in the kitchen. This one was slower, less like falling, more like surrender. His lips found mine with aching deliberation, his hand at the nape of my neck, grounding me. My fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, not in a moment of weakness, but of clarity. We pulled apart only when the fire popped loudly behind us. I stared at him, breathless. He didn't say anything, neither did I, but everything that had been unsaid now filled the room around us. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. We didn't sleep together that night, not in the way people expect when they hear about these things. That fact didn't make the silence less dangerous or the air less charged. It only made it more intimate, more complicated. After that second kiss, we didn't speak. He rose first, walked to the other end of the room, and busied himself with the fireplace again, stoking the flames like it could keep something inside us from spilling out. I sat on the couch, legs curled beneath me, pulse still racing. The fire had warmed the room, but my skin stayed electric, like my body hadn't caught up to the heat. Around me, we were careful to avoid eye contact for the rest of the evening. Yet every movement, every shared space, every brush of air between us pulsed with awareness. I showered before bed, needing the steam to strip something away from me, guilt, maybe, or restraint. I don't remember what song played on my phone, only the sensation of my hand trembling slightly as I dried myself with the oversized towel. I chose a thin cotton nightdress, the hem brushing mid-thigh, simple but not thoughtless. No robe, I told myself. The fireplace was warm enough. It was. He was already in his room when I walked past, door half shut, light spilled from beneath it, muted and yellow. Didn't pause, but I listened. I didn't knock, but I waited, just a moment, hoping for something, hoping not to be the one who asked. In the morning, the house was quiet again. Birds called from the trees, their songs dissonant and bright. I made coffee, poured 2 mugs, left one on the counter just in case. He came into the kitchen shirtless, hair still damp, and thanked me in a voice so low I nearly didn't hear it. We didn't talk about the night before. It hovered between us, thick as fog and just as obscuring. We left the lake house by noon. The drive back was longer. Winding through light traffic and sun-dappled roads, I stared out the window most of the time, pretending to admire the scenery while trying to tame the chaos unfolding inside me. My phone buzzed a few times with messages from my husband. Short, routine, unemotional. He was finishing dinner with clients, pleased with the weekend's progress. Asked how things were at home. I responded politely, lied only once. When we pulled into our driveway, I felt the weight of our return settle on, my shoulders like wet wool. The house stood still exactly as we left it, but something inside me felt altered, cracked, like I'd stepped into my own home wearing someone else's skin. That night, I couldn't sit still. I moved through the house without purpose, straightening objects that didn't need adjusting, rereading old recipes, pretending to look for misplaced things. Eventually, I poured a glass of wine I didn't want and sat at the kitchen table waiting. He came in, casual again, barefoot, a book in his hand. He didn't sit across from me. He leaned against the counter, flipping through the pages absently. The silence pressed against my chest. "Do you regret it?" I asked, surprising even myself. He didn't look up. No. That word settled somewhere deep. I took another sip. The wine burned. "You?" I set the glass down slowly. "I'm still deciding." He nodded once. A pause. Then, "You don't look like you're sorry." I wasn't. That was the truth. Whatever guilt should have bloomed inside me had been smothered by something hotter. Wilder, not love, not yet, but hunger. A craving I hadn't allowed myself to name in years. My marriage had become a routine so seamless I could sleep through it, and for the most part I had. But now I was awake. Every sense sharpened, every nerve alive. Later that night, I went to bed early, knowing my husband would return in the morning. I lay on my side facing the wall, trying not to imagine what he would see in my eyes when he walked through the door. Would he sense it? Would my skin betray me? Would he notice the scent of another's touch beneath the detergent, the perfume, the smile? Around midnight, I heard a knock. Not the door, the wall, 3 soft taps from the room beside mine. It was absurd, childish even. But I understood. I didn't answer, not immediately. I waited 10 minutes, heart thudding. Then I slipped out of bed and into the hallway, barefoot again, wrapped in only that same cotton nightdress. I knocked once. A single reply, his room was darker than mine. One bedside lamp cast a circle of light across the floor. He stood by the window, hands in the pockets of his pajama pants, eyes fixed on nothing. He turned slowly, like he expected me. I didn't say a word. I stepped forward, closed the door behind me, and walked until the space between us vanished. This kiss was quieter but longer, the kind that asks for nothing and gives everything. There was no ceremony in the way we touched. No rush, no conquest, just the unfolding of something already promised. Our lips met like an agreement. My fingers found his wrist. His hand brushed the back of my thigh. I pulled away first, just enough to see his face. His eyes met mine, not questioning, not pleading, just there, honest, waiting. I leaned my forehead against his and closed my eyes. Neither of us spoke again. That night in the morning, before dawn, I slipped back into my room. My husband would be home soon. I changed the sheets, showered again, applied lotion with trembling hands. I dressed carefully, a navy blouse and beige slacks, respectable, clean. I set the table for breakfast. When the garage door opened, I met him with a practiced smile and a kiss on the cheek. "How was the weekend?" he asked. "Quiet," I said. "Just as you left it." I had always believed in equilibrium, that if one area of your life tipped too far in one direction, something else would naturally correct it. It was how I had rationalized years of muted affection in my marriage, of the slow erosion of physical closeness. I told myself it was normal, that after a certain point, comfort outweighed desire, that love could be a kind of quiet arrangement. But now, after the lake house, after the hallway, after that night, I realized I had been lying to myself with dangerous grace, and yet, after the return of my husband, life resumed with the kind of practiced rhythm that people on the outside would call perfect. He unpacked with routine efficiency, handed me a box of chocolates I didn't care for, and gave me a bland summary of his meetings and dinners, none of which I retained. We stood in the kitchen like strangers who remembered they used to love each other but couldn't recall how it had felt. That morning, I looked at him differently. Not with disgust, not even resentment, just detachment. Like seeing someone through a pane of fogged glass, knowing you should care, but no longer remembering why, and yet something in me sought to restore balance, guilt, maybe, or the phantom of it. That night, after dinner, I initiated closeness, not out of longing, but curiosity. I let him touch me, kissed him with lips that still remembered someone else's breath. I closed my eyes and tried to feel something, but I couldn't. His hands felt foreign, predictable, polite. He asked if I was all right afterward, and I lied, said I was tired, said it had been a long week. He accepted the answer too easily. That was always his flaw. He never looked too closely. He trusted comfort more than truth. The days that followed were tightrope thin. I moved through them with poise, fulfilling the image of a devoted wife. I went to the market, returned emails, planned a dinner with neighbors. I made lists and checked them twice, but beneath the surface, I was dissolving into something less contained. I would catch glimpses of him, the man who lived just down the hall, walking out of the shower, brushing past me on the stairs, offering a quiet good morning in the kitchen. Each moment felt like a match struck near dry paper. We didn't speak about the night again, not directly. But everything between us was laced with the memory of it. The way he looked at me when my husband wasn't in the room. The pause in his breath when I passed him on the way to the laundry, the subtle shifts in posture, the silent questions neither of us dared voice. One afternoon, I received a call from a friend, someone I hadn't seen in months, whose voice I'd always associated with truth. She asked if everything was all right, said I sounded different, not sad, just distant. I laughed it off, but the remark clung to me long after the conversation ended. Was I different? I sat alone in the living room later, glass of wine untouched, staring at the faint outline of dust on the windowsill. I was no longer who I had been months ago. That woman had measured her worth by how still she could remain, how well she could blend into the background of someone else's life. This new self, the one who had tasted something forbidden and craved more, frightened and thrilled me in equal measure. One night, I walked into his room. Not in secret, not with any plan. He was reading, legs stretched across the bed. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what I'm doing," I said, the words dry in my throat. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer reassurance, only said, "Neither do I." That was the closest we came to honesty in weeks. We talked that night, really talked, not about what had happened between us, but about everything else. His childhood, the distance with his father, the way he never felt fully at home in either parent's life. I listened, asked questions. I didn't know I had the right to ask. He answered carefully, never bitter, but not detached either. There was pain in his words, but also a quiet strength. He had learned to survive in spaces where he wasn't truly wanted. It struck me how similar we were. Two people orbiting around someone who never truly saw them. He asked about me, too, about my life before the marriage, my job, my dreams. I told him more than I had told anyone in years, that I used to paint, that I once thought about living in a small town by the sea, that sometimes when my husband fell asleep first, I would sit in the hallway just to hear the silence and feel like I belonged to myself. That night, we didn't touch, but something more dangerous happened. We began to know each other. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the sky still bruised with pre-dawn light. I sat on the porch with a blanket over my legs and watched the sun rise slowly. Over the rooftops, the air was cool, fragrant with the smell of rain-soaked earth. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, trying to find something that felt like peace. But peace no longer lived here, only want, only memory, only the thrum of something I no longer knew how to silence. I woke up before him, not my husband. Him, the one whose room no longer felt like foreign territory. The clock read 6:40, the window was open, curtains trembling slightly from the early morning breeze. The air smelled of warm dust and night-dampened leaves. His breathing was slow, steady, his lips slightly parted, one hand curled into a loose fist, like even in sleep he held something tightly inside. I didn't touch him. I didn't even fully turn toward him. I just watched. Committed the moment to memory. Tried to understand how far I had already gone, and where it was taking me. I left quietly, slipping into my own room, without a sound. Almost on autopilot, I showered for too long, letting the hot water beat against my back until my skin flushed. I watched the droplets slide off my body as if they could rinse the thoughts from my mind, but they couldn't. Not anymore. not after. All this, the towel didn't absorb guilt, lotion didn't erase scent, and the worst part? I didn't want it to. My husband had returned the night before, suitcase in one hand, a basket of gourmet wine and cheese in the other from a French boutique I'd never visited. He was always generous. He could be thoughtful. In his way, but when he touched my cheek in greeting, I didn't feel tenderness. I felt the rough texture of his palm. It startled me how foreign it had become. At breakfast, I sat across from him while he scrolled through the news, taking occasional sips of coffee, mumbling about the market. I responded on cue, my voice even, my expressions trained, but in my mind, I couldn't stop wondering, does he suspect? That's when I made my first mistake. He set his phone face down and looked at me directly. Not distracted, not casually, fully. "You're acting strange," he said. I blinked, heartbeat quickening. "In what way?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe you've got someone else?" The way he said it was almost flippant, like a joke he didn't really believe, a provocation, a test, a fantasy disguised as suspicion. He didn't say it with anger, not even fear. More like curiosity, as if he were daring me, but my hand trembled just slightly as I reached for my coffee cup. He saw it. "That's ridiculous," I said. Not too sharp, not too soft, scripted, but passable. "I've just been tired." He didn't press, just gave a small nod and went back to his eggs. Maybe he believed me, or maybe he didn't want to know the truth. That had always been his flaw. He avoided depth. He trusted appearances more than he should have. Still, the words lingered like smoke in my lungs. The fact that he had spoken them at all shifted something. We were no longer safe. Our secret was no longer invisible. The room had changed. Later that day, I left the house for a walk. I needed air, space between questions. I wore my coat, a soft scarf, sunglasses. I wandered into a park I rarely visited. Sat alone on a bench beneath a tree just starting to bloom. Around me, the world carried on. Joggers, strollers, barking dogs, everyone wrapped in their own little lives that gave me a strange kind of comfort. For a few minutes, I almost forgot, and then I got his message. "Tonight I'm leaving, for good." That was it. Clean, direct, no preamble, no drama, just fact. I read it 3 times. My fingers went cold. Something inside me collapsed. I didn't know what I felt. Fear or desire. Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe just the sharp sting of consequence. When I returned home, my husband was trimming the garden hedges, meticulous as ever. I asked if he wanted anything special for dinner. He said we should order in. I nodded. Everything was ordinary, so perfectly, painfully ordinary. But inside, I was unraveling. Later, when the house had settled and the sun dipped behind the trees, I walked to his room, the man I wasn't supposed to feel anything for. He was sitting on his bed, already dressed. A small travel bag rested at his feet. I closed the door behind me. "You're really leaving?" I asked. He nodded once. "It's time." "Where?" "Does it matter?" The silence between us felt heavy, like a rope tightening. "Was this a mistake?" he asked. Calm, not accusing. I stared at him, the light from the window casting shadows across his face. After a moment, I shook my head. No, we didn't embrace. We didn't kiss. But we stood so close I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. My breath shortened. My hands itched to reach for him, but I didn't. I turned and left the room without another word. I returned to my husband in the living room. He was watching a documentary, legs stretched out, a bowl of almonds balanced on his chest. I sat down beside him, smiled, asked what I missed. He started, explaining. His voice was familiar, predictable, safe, and all I could think was, he's leaving. And I don't know who I'll be when he's gone. I didn't sleep that night. I lay still, facing the window, listening to the subtle ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the house settling into itself. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass like a whisper, asking a question I didn't want to answer. What happens when he's gone? The air in the room felt heavier than usual. Not warm, not cold, just dense, like it was holding its breath with me, My husband lay beside me, one arm sprawled across his chest, snoring softly, the way he always did when he drank a little wine before bed. I didn't envy his peace. I resented it. How easy it was for him to rest, unaware that everything around him had already changed shape. Around 4 in the morning, I got out of bed. Quietly, slowly, I moved through the house. In darkness, barefoot, guided only by memory. The hallway light was off, his room closed, and I stood outside the door longer than necessary. My hand rested on the handle. I didn't knock. He was gone. There was no bag, no jacket on the chair, no shoes by the door. The bed was made, the window was closed, the room smelled like linen and absence. I stood there for a full minute. Maybe. More? My fingers dug into the frame of the door. My breath caught halfway between inhale and collapse. I didn't cry. There wasn't space for tears yet. Only the hollow realization that the thing I had let grow in secret had slipped away. Without ceremony, I walked downstairs, made coffee, stared out the window. The street was quiet, bathed in that in-between light that isn't quite dawn and not quite night. Everything looked familiar, but it felt foreign, like stepping into a house staged for a photograph. At 7, my husband came down in his robe, yawning, scratching his jaw, already talking about a contractor's quote for the upstairs bathroom. I nodded, stirred my coffee, answered him like I always did, with enough attention to keep him from noticing I wasn't really present. But the silence around us had a different flavor now. It wasn't just distance, it was a secret buried in my chest, pressing up against my ribs like it wanted to escape. A truth with no one left to receive it. I spent the afternoon rearranging. The guest room, I told my husband it was for better airflow, that I needed a change. He shrugged. I folded bed sheets I knew I wouldn't use again. I dusted his desk. I opened the drawer where he'd left a few of his things, a pair of earbuds, an old receipt, a pen with the cap chewed. I held them one by one, like they were artifacts, of something that hadn't been real, even though it had been too real. Too raw, too close. At some point, I found myself sitting on the floor, back against the bed, knees pulled to my chest, and that's when it hit me. Not the loss, not the guilt, but the craving. It wasn't just him I missed. It was myself, the version of me he had awakened, the woman who paid attention to how her body felt in clothes, who looked at her reflection not to check for flaws but to see herself, the woman who hadn't felt invisible, who hadn't disappeared in politeness or expectation. I tried to hold on to that. I tried to carry her with me into the following days, but it was like trying to cup smoke in your hands. My husband noticed. Eventually, 3 days later, as we sat watching the news, he muted the TV without warning. Turned to me, face unreadable. "You've been off," he said. I looked at him, waited. "I don't know what it is, but it's like you're here, and not..." I didn't deny it. I didn't lie. I simply said, "I don't feel like myself lately." He reached for my hand, squeezed it. "Maybe we should take a trip. Just us." I nodded. Agreed. But somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that it was already too late for that. You can't patch a wall when the foundation is cracked. You can't return to a version of yourself that no longer fits. And I was already becoming someone else. That night, I opened a journal I hadn't touched in years. Not the kind with neat lines and daily affirmations, but the real one, the one I kept hidden behind the sweaters in my closet. I turned to a blank page and wrote, "He left, but I stayed." Then after a pause, and I don't know which of us made the bigger mistake, I slept with the window open. The wind returned, but this time it didn't ask questions. It simply listened. It's strange. The things we think we'll remember forever and the ones that end up lingering. You'd think the kiss, the lake house, the night in his room would be what stayed with me. And yes, those moments are there, etched, sharply into the folds of my memory like glass pressed into skin. But what haunts me more are the ordinary things. The half-washed coffee mug he used, the way his footsteps sounded on the stairs at night, the faint creak of his mattress when he shifted in bed just on the other side of the wall. Those are the things that echo, even now, weeks past, quietly. My husband and I took the trip he suggested. A long weekend by the coast. The weather was perfect, the hotel charming, the food predictable in a way people call good. We walked along the beach, his hand occasionally brushing mine, the way couples do when they've been together long enough to value rhythm more than excitement. He told me I seemed lighter, that the break had done me good. I smiled. I even laughed. And in a way, it was true. I was lighter. But not because I had let something go, because I had accepted that it would never return. We didn't speak about what had changed. And I no longer felt the need to confess. That part of me, the woman who wanted to be understood, explained, forgiven, had slipped away quietly, along with the man who had woken her. Back home, I found myself drifting through rooms like a ghost that no longer haunted. I no longer touched the doorknob of his old room when I passed it. I stopped checking the hallway at night, stopped expecting to hear the soft knock that had once made my heart leap. Instead, I moved forward, but not in the way stories like this usually end. There was no epiphany, no dramatic confrontation, no broken dishes or slammed doors, no passionate resolution with my husband. We simply adjusted, like furniture slowly pushed back into place after someone has bumped the table. But I was not the same. In the mornings, I began to paint again. Not for show, not for anyone's praise, just for the act of it. My hands remembered the motion, the smell of oils, the tension of the canvas beneath my brush. It grounded me, gave me something to hold beside silence. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out a drawer in the guest room, I found something he had left behind, a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages of a paperback novel. At first, I thought it was just a receipt or note, but it was a sketch, not detailed. Just a few lines. A woman seated at a table, her face turned slightly away, hair pinned up, a coffee cup in one hand. There was a stillness to the drawing that made my breath catch. He'd captured something I didn't realize he saw in me. Poise, maybe. Or grief. I kept it, didn't frame it, didn't hide it. I placed it in my journal, behind the page where I had written he left, but I stayed. Sometimes I reread those words, and now I understand them differently. He left, yes, but what stayed wasn't just me. It was the version of myself he had peeled back, layer by careful layer, the part that had learned to feel again, to want, to ache, to choose, because that's what no one tells you about infidelity, not the salacious versions, not the ones framed in scandal or shame. The truth is much quieter. Sometimes it's not about betrayal at all. Sometimes it's about rediscovery, about remembering that your life isn't fixed, that your body can still surprise you, that desire, even in its most inconvenient form, can be a mirror. I didn't leave my husband, and I didn't beg for more. I simply began to exist differently within the walls of my own life. Sometimes he still asks what changed. I tell him I don't know, that maybe I'm just growing, and he nods, accepts the mystery, loves me, in the only way he knows how. But I know, change didn't come like a storm. It came like a whisper, like a knock on a door I wasn't supposed to open, but I did. And I will never unhear what stood on the other side,